the Beaver Science and Research Working Group speaker series. And for our October presentation, we're very excited to have everybody here. And I'm briefly going to introduce our speaker, Sarah Woodbury, who is now a PhD student in environmental sociology at Utah State. And Sarah's going to give a little bit more of an introduction to herself, but today she is talking about We Love Them, We Shoot Them, engaging agricultural values and beaver coexistence in an Indigenous-led restoration project. So Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sandra. My name is Sarah Woodbury, and I'm excited to be here with you all today, sharing some of my research on values in a rural restoration context. And just a little bit of background. So this work was done for my master's thesis at Utah State University in the Environment and Society Department. And it was also done as part of Sageland Collaborative's Stream Restoration Program. And as was introduced, I'm now continuing some of these strands as a doctoral student in environmental sociology at USU. So prepare yourselves for some social science today, but I hope that I can offer some clear practical value to each of your work. So yeah, feel free to just put questions in the Q&A and we can get to those at the end. Okay, so let's dive in. So in the American West, which is where I'm located, we are facing multiple serious ecological concerns. In such an arid region, climate change means increased variability in precipitation, higher summer temperatures, longer droughts, all of which will have major consequences for a lot of groups in the region, including, native species, farming and ranching livelihoods, and indigenous communities who have already faced socio-ecological upheaval. And we're also seeing widespread habitat and biodiversity loss. This photo here that you see is of Great Salt Lake, which you may have heard of if you're coming out of Utah or the West. If not, as an overview, critically low water levels are threatening millions of migratory birds, as well as human health and a cascading array of other issues. And this will have hemispheric impacts. So kind of notably, as you all know in your own work, our issues aren't just our issues. And I'm sure each of you are dealing with some kind of similar complex issue in your own region. So in seeking issues to some of these really behemoth, complex issues, Western conservation communities have often reduced the world into its various parts, as our predecessors in Western science did. So a wetland, say, is seen to have its measurable ecological processes and wildlife communities, while human societies are seen to have our, values and cultures and concerns. But increasingly, as we face, some of these complex threats brought on by climate change and biodiversity loss, we're seeing conservation leaders, practitioners, and scholars turning toward approaches that can see and engage an interwoven whole instead. So just, a view that understands humans as deeply embedded in nature. Often these are learning from interdisciplinary work, colleagues doing other types of research, or from Indigenous approaches. And I think specifically of my friend and an elder in the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation, Darren Perry, who is at the forefront of a lot of ecological issues here in the Intermountain West. Like what I described earlier, the potential ecological collapse at Great Salt Lake. But he often describes that all the science in the world won't solve the issues we're facing today, but that we need to address values. So in the West, of course, as well as across the US, water is, of course, a huge concern. And as we're looking toward projected climate futures and trying to figure out how the heck to prepare landscapes and communities for coming shifts, strong collaborative work in riparian areas specifically is critical, as each of you knows well. And so this requires a really conscious turn toward a lot of different ways of knowing and relating to landscapes. Kyle White is an Indigenous philosopher and a climate justice scholar, and he writes of the critical need in facing some of these large-scale climate-induced complex issues for focusing on relationships of trust. In addition, the UN made this decade the decade on ecosystem restoration, and Fisher and colleagues called for that to be a social ecological endeavor, or basically to bring in more human considerations into ecological restoration and water management. So, as you likely know from your own work, collaborations between diverse communities is really complex, and it requires long-term commitments to understanding and deeply engaging one another's values. And so I just want to share a brief window into my research that kind of takes a magnifying glass to some of these values in a specific restoration context. So where am I in this research, regionally and culturally? Just to ground us here. So this project occurred in a small area in the southeastern corner of Idaho, which is in the domain of what's been called the Mormon culture region, which is this image you see on the right here. And I note this just because the population that I worked with that I'll describe a little bit later is 85% LDS, or of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and can be really considered a sample for understanding agricultural and rural values, across this region, just because it's so heavily defined and influenced by the culture of this religion. And on kind of a more national scale, just to quickly note, the church ranks as the 5th largest private landowner in the US, and is present in over 160 countries, has a really massive global investment portfolio. So we can kind of think of understanding the values of one small rural community as both being applicable to other small practitioner contexts working with water, as well as quickly expanding into national spheres. And then also to note, the research that I'll share primarily focused on lands known and managed since time immemorial by the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation, as well as Ute, Goshute, and Paiute tribes. And so I just want to take a moment to honor elders of this land, living and ancestral, including those who have really directed and supported this research and related work on these lands. I just want to specifically name Darren Perry and Rios Pacheco. And yeah. So then just a quick kind of introduction to myself and where I am situated in this research. I approach this research as a 6th generation Utahn who come from early settlers of this region. And I've worked in conservation for the past 5 years, both professionally and as a student. And in just my 30 years as someone living here, I've seen some really alarmingly large changes on the land. And I've also sometimes seen misunderstanding between local communities and conservation communities, where it's easy to sort of treat a rural group or perhaps an LDS group as a monolith, or assume that there's not like a conservation ethic there to work with. Or at least that's the sense I've picked up on here and there. I've also really seen the power of collaboration, though, in my work, and I really believe in it. So this work that I've embarked on is all about finding some of the shared spaces between communities and watering the seedlings that connect us, the values that are connecting us in kind of times of division. So just to reiterate, this work matters for a few reasons. This research occurs in the thick of an unfolding ecological crisis at Great Salt Lake, which is downstream from the project I'll describe. And I'll say over and over that, a central argument that I'm making is that this lake, or any land or water that we're working with, can be conceived of as a direct recipient of local land ethics and values. And this applies to any riverscape or landscape. Ecologies, again, are direct recipients of the values of the communities who live there. So as all of us here today, interested in improving the well-being of beavers and related ecologies, we really must carefully engage with and work to understand local environmental values and perceptions. So let's dive in. So this image here that you're seeing is the Wuda'ogwa site, the restoration site. So this historically was a gathering place for the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. There are hot springs up on the hill there that you can't really see in this image. but the tribe would come and gather at the hot springs during the winter until 1863, which is when the Bear River Massacre occurred, which is the largest massacre west of the Mississippi. And that year, California Army volunteers massacred over 500 members of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. So the tribe is working in this area and has been working for a number of years on a really large interdisciplinary restoration project. So it kind of has three main areas. One is reclaiming the story of the space, and that's led by folks like Darren and Brad Perry, and the tribe working to establish a cultural center here. There's an ecological restoration piece that the tribe has worked with partners on. This is to support culturally valued plants likely to survive in, modeled climate scenarios. It builds on work by folks like Mayton Mimbu Perry and Will Munger and others. And then there's also this kind of third piece, which is incorporating getting water back to Great Salt Lake, which again is downstream and is on the verge of ecological collapse. So one particularly troubled tributary to Bear River at this site is called Battle Creek, or as one rancher called it in my interviews, the Chocolate River. And you can see in this aerial image here on the left, that brown line running right next to the road there, that's Battle Creek. And in the bottom left hand is where it joins Bear River. So you can see the degradation. There's extensive agricultural use in this area upstream from where this site is, which Wuda is over to the left off of that aerial image. And so this agricultural use includes flood and sprinkler irrigation, livestock grazing, beaver extirpation, and farming in the area that have been going on for 5-6 generations now. The stream itself has really high phosphorus concentrations, especially at the bottom of the stream after it flows through ag fields, has a high sediment load, and is highly incised due to both soil type and land use. And so the tribe in their project has been working to engage upstream landowners in restoration. So that includes things like building beaver dam analogs, bringing back beavers, supporting degraded habitats. And so again, 85% of Franklin County currently is LDS, and many are descendants of LDS settlers. So I just want to briefly speak to kind of the cultural and social context that this work is happening. There's a lot that I could say about it, but to be very brief, this area involves groups with a really complex history and very different values and approaches to landscapes. We're working in a context of historical genocide, as well as current cultural erasure that impacts what kinds of practices and relationships happen on the landscape. Settlers brought with them grid systems and land enclosure, which created really new, again, ways of interacting with land, new political boundaries, restricted what resources were available to tribes. And kind of back to this idea that ecologies, again, are direct recipients of land values and ethics held by the human communities living there. And so we can see this bottom image here is an old depiction of the Salt Lake Valley, which is just downstream from the site. But we see just this very different ecology established, this like grid system. The upper left photo that you see there is around the site that I was working. This is an old depiction of land enclosure, who owns what land, which settlers own which land. And Rio and Ogden are scholars that define, introduce land ethics that have resultant ecological harm as invasive ideologies, which is kind of an interesting way to think about the context in which we are working, restoration contexts, to think about, we often identify an invasive species, but rather to start to think about, well, what ideologies are creating what we're seeing on the landscape. And so, interestingly, in 2006, Brehm and Eisenhower did a study on modern populations in this region, looking at specifically their domination over nature values, or those values that say that humans are meant to dominate or control the land. And they found higher domination over nature values in LDS populations than others. Yet, other scholars have noted a really interestingly strong environmental ethic in LDS doctrines. So it's kind of this gap. And so I approached this research in this LDS community in part to kind of explore this gap here, wondering how are landowners thinking about land and water and wildlife, and what are some kind of opportunities and barriers for the tribe to work with these folks. And so I worked largely with this. Oh, can you still see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I had a little glitch. Okay. Yes, so I'm working largely with this kind of relational values thinking, which relational values in a nutshell from Klein and colleagues is values linking people and ecosystems via tangible and intangible relationships to nature, as well as the principles, virtues, and notions of a good life that may accompany these. So essentially looking at values that tie local communities to land. And again, to quote Darren Perry, all the science in the world won't solve the issues we're facing today, but we've got to address values. So project partners working with the tribe, have a lot of ecological information and data, and that's being employed beautifully. But if there's not the ability to speak to the values of communities who control, lands and waters upstream, the natural science can't be used. So I kind of honed in on these relational values. And so one approach to restoration projects focused on climate adaptation is the resistance, resilience, transformation scale. Obviously, approaching some of these projects is not so easy. And so this is one kind of recent tool that has attempted to help with some of this work, again, developed for climate adaptation projects. And essentially, conservation as a whole has traditionally kind of focused on resisting change, which I'm sure you all are aware of, but recently has focused more on kind of a transformational view, essentially making sure that ecosystems are being prepared for new futures or managing for change. And this hasn't yet been totally integrated into conservation practice, so it's something that folks are moving toward. At least that's what Peterson St. Laurent, the folks who offered this scale, note. And then they also note that kind of even in their approach to try to encourage transformational work in some of these climate adaptation contexts, there is a missing piece, which is local knowledge and perceptions, again, and working lands at large are not included either. And the authors call specifically for further research that explores using this scale and adapting it to other contexts in climate adaptation projects. And they also speak to the need for understanding the human and social components of adaptation. And so my research specifically, I kind of innovated by applying this topology to rural landowner perceptions and knowledge along Battle Creek. And so that kind of brings us to the research questions. So I wanted to know, in planning for the future of their land management, which categories of the RRT topology apply to landowners' current perceptions? What kinds of relational values link landowners to land and water? And to what extent are these values and perceptions barriers or opportunities to downstream climate adapted restoration, or the work that the tribe is doing? And so I interviewed about half of the estimated number of folks living and working along Battle Creek. I did interviews with these folks that were about an hour and a half, sometimes all day, depending on the situation. But I did a semi-structured protocol, which basically just means I had questions I wanted to ask all of these landowners, and there was also room for different follow-ups or switching the order, kind of adapting to each interview. And I ended my recruitment when I started hearing the same ideas over and over, this idea of, idea saturation, or I kind of kept getting recommended the same names of folks to talk to. So these interviews were mostly men. They were mostly in person, and I recorded the interviews and transcribed them through a service called Otter AI. And so my analysis, after I transcribed all these interviews and had all of this text data, I looked through this data coding for a couple of things. This RRT framework, ideas pulled from that framework, relational values, or again, values connecting folks to lands and waters, local ecological knowledge and attitudes related to Battle Creek, Beaver attitudes, and opportunities and barriers related to the tribe's work. And so I kind of started out with this list of things I was looking for based on, the theories I was engaging. But then I also added emergent codes as they arose throughout the analysis. And then lastly, I took extensive notes from a Bear River adjudication meeting, as well as conversations with one landowner who didn't want to officially interview. So I just included that as, further contextualizing data. And so I, through this work, identified 13 specific relational values, but I'm not going to go through all of those in interest of time. But I'll focus on just two key findings here. So first, instrumental values are, just to briefly describe, are values related to valuing land in as much as it is able to be used by humans. So I looked for this in the interviews and found that it outnumbered other relational values I identified by almost 6 times. So counting all of the appearances of various relational values, instrumental values was incredibly strong. The second most frequently mentioned relational value was tradition, or history, or legacy, which kind of refers to ideas of inheritance or continuing practices the way they've always been. And then the third really prominent relational value was multi-species relationships, or folks talking about their relationships with other species, which showed up strongly. And so this quote from interviewee 14 says, "And we used to do like 40 acres and 40 milk cows. When I think back, that used to be my favorite part. And all the cows had names. But when you have 200 milk cows, then they wear a number on their neck." So this quote demonstrates some of the connections of these 3 kind of values and ways of thinking about the land, as well as another thing that really showed up, which is, the very real economic pressures that producers are facing in the region. And then another kind of finding that I noticed was that livelihood was a really key emergent relational value. So I mentioned that instrumental values showed up really strongly, and that was something I expected and really was the case. However, this kind of second finding really kind of challenged that or made it more complex. I found this other value of livelihood, which was deeply tied to family and to legacy and to care, both for landscapes and for community, to hard work, and to personal identity. It really was not contained to this limited instrumental view. And one quote that kind of exemplifies some of this is from interviewee 10, who says, "We say manure gets into your veins and you can't get it out. The dirt gets in there and it's almost like a calling or something. Even when I was at school, I would come back here and work in the summers. I moved back and go to work because that's just what I do. It's what I am." So in this quote, we can see this really deep identity that's connected with landscapes and livelihoods and working the land. That again, this producer is not seeing the land as just instrumental, though he does express a relationship with relying on the land. However, he actually sees himself as the land and as his process and his work. And then another kind of key part of this finding, the second piece, is that some values and themes emerged that had kind of a negative affect. So that's things like anxiety or seeing wildlife as a threat, or feeling disdain for other natural entities like beavers. Any kind of values that were less friendly than the initial values that kind of I had come up with. So yeah, I came into the analysis drawing from relational values literature, but didn't find some of these negative values reflected in the literature, but found them emerging in my interviews. And again, these kind of like more adversarial relational values were really complex, and yeah, quite relevant to painting a fuller picture of perceptions and values of landowners along Battle Creek. And one quote that I think is really interesting in this realm is from interviewee 14. So he says, "Beavers, I love them. We shoot them." And his dad responds, "True story." And so some of the context here is that interviewee 14 was paraphrasing his father's comments about beavers. We just talked a lot about beavers, for probably 10 minutes. And that included everything from a serious admiration of beavers' work ethic to the very real issues that they cause with canals, and on folks' operations. And so, yeah, so his father kind of confirms this summary, like beavers, love them, shoot them. And so I did find some scholars have done a little bit of work around what they call disvalues. So Liso and all talk about disvalues or some of these more kind of maybe negative or complicated relationships with land as better capturing people's preferences and subjective perspectives, and better accounting for the positions that people are speaking from, socially and environmentally. And so basically, as we see in this quote, whether or not an individual is directly depending on a landscape complicates the appearance of these kind of neatly categorized relational values. So kind of this romantic idea of a beaver as either something beloved or something that's kind of a villain gets really complex, that there is both present, and at least was in these interviews. And another quote I wanted to just highlight is from interviewee 2, who says, "When you work a patch of land, you'll find out that you don't own it. It owns you." And so again, this quote demonstrates kind of this nuanced expression of what working lands mean, and how they're valued, and how we can be thinking about relational values in some of these rural spaces. So I kind of conceptualize this as a bi-directional relationship with land that could otherwise be simplified or viewed by some, conservation practitioners or communities as just instrumental. But when you dig a little bit, there's something else really going on here that I think is important and powerful to note. And so again, just to drive it home, values are embedded in these kind of entangled webs of self and community definition. This includes livelihood and understanding of self, legacy, history. There's a lot going on. And then kind of the second piece of the results that I focused on for this research was on the ground restoration barriers and opportunities for the tribe. They kind of fell under these 3 categories. Social barriers, things came up largely around a desire for transparency. There was some amount of fear among landowners about changes happening to the landscape that they weren't aware of or couldn't imagine. Second, economic restraints and barriers came up. Folks need to make a profit and are often operating in really slim margins in some of these rural communities. So that came up. And then third, actual just biophysical restraints came up that landowners were very aware of and had experienced in their operations. That's things like soil type or alkalinity, or just the complexity of reintroducing beavers. And specifically related to beavers, interestingly, there was noted both the reality that beavers might impact human communities, that they're going to cause problems, to quote one landowner, but there was also a concern for the beavers that Some folks noted seeing beaver dams and that they washed out because the area is so degraded that they're actually concerned for bringing beavers back in, and are, they've seen where beavers thrive and don't imagine that it's in this place. And so of the 5 categories included in this RRT scale, landowner thinking overwhelmingly concentrated within this active resistance category. So that's defined as actions designed to actively maintain current or historical structures and functions, which structures and functions defined as historical, of course, vary between groups and individuals. The Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation restoration focuses on, species present in the mid-1800s, while landowners are maintaining agricultural landscapes introduced to the region by settlers, just really different time scales. But for the purposes of this research, I used historical as perceived by producers. None of the interviewees described planning more than about a year ahead in their operations, which matters for conservationists seeking to support social ecologies that can weather coming climate changes, of course. I did find the scale to be somewhat difficult to apply to this context. I'll note it's made for conservation contexts, and this is a little bit of a different situation. However, I did feel that kind of the underpinning ideas and general framework could be useful for conservation managers seeking to collaborate with private landowners. So as I went through and kind of sorted through these interviews and themes, I wondered if there might be a version of this framework that could kind of more clearly work for these contexts. So I kind of made this scale here to try to translate some of these basic elements of the RRT topology into contexts where conservationists are working with producers. So in my opinion, this kind of thinking allows for more targeted and collaborative and realistic collaboration for climate adaptation projects that are, seeking to move the needle for social ecologies to more transformational approaches. So just as a brief example, a conservation group working with a private landowner on stream restoration work might go in, thinking of, this topology or some of these categories, and identify where that landowner is on the scale, and then tailor their actions to moving the needle 1 or 2 steps, considering the values of that landowner and that community. So it's my attempt to sort of bridge some of the difficulties I found working with that topology with what might be useful in a conservation context. There's a lot of opportunities for future research from this work. Of course, yeah, this is just one master's thesis chapter that I was able to do. So evaluating the usefulness of this kind of updated, translated topology would be really incredible. Seeing how it might apply or not to various conservation contexts, and then taking a deeper look at instrumental values is another key piece, perhaps comparing livelihood values with the ways that recreational users of lands frame values, and then comparing these findings to similar areas in the West. Again, just understanding values is really what moves the needle in some of these complex conservation projects. So I think there's a lot there. And then I just wanted to briefly give a little sneak peek to another piece of my research that I did, which is, as I learned more about some of these complex values that I've briefed you all on in one small Mormon community, I started thinking more about LDS environmental values at large, which turns out are not well documented at all in the literature. So I won't go into details, but in case you want to watch my full thesis defense, you're welcome to. I specifically kind of zoomed out to the Great Salt Lake watershed and asked in interviews across the watershed about how folks are thinking about land and water, looking at, the percentages that fall under anthropocentric and biocentric, and then this area in between, this kind of pluricentric area. I also created a number of relational values that I noted in interviews that apply to LDS groups, and found some just really interesting things. But in a nutshell, I thought that this domination over nature value that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, I imagined that this would really be one side of the pole as far as values go, and that the other pole would be this really interesting environmental ethic included in doctrine. However, I found that they were actually quite intertwined, which is fascinating. So if you have work that focuses in some of these LDS dominant areas, this might be of interest. I just wanted to pop that in there. But to conclude, one of the most important things that I found is that instrumental and domination over nature values are really nuanced, with my study finding that livelihood and identity are key values missing from the way that we're thinking about values and working with folks in these kind of projects. Second finding that was key was that values that might appear to be limited to use of the land, or these instrumental values, are actually embedded in complex webs of definition of community and self. Third, landowners do not appear to be planning for projected landscape shifts, even if they do recognize extreme weather patterns or prolonged drought. And so the analysis, again, highlighted some limitations in both current value frameworks and the RRT scale in agricultural producer contexts. So that topology is a proposed version translating the scale into a form that might be useful for transformational ecological work in ag communities. And then lastly, restoration projects should prioritize transparency with locals when working on transformational ecological projects. Again, thinking back to that scale, if most folks are not necessarily planning beyond about a year in advance on these tight economic margins, understanding that really clear transparency about transformation is key for working with these communities. And I wanted to end on just briefly sharing one outcome from this research. So the work of myself and colleagues on this team, including the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation, led by Brad Perry, researchers Will Munger and Sarah Klain, nonprofits, big shout out to Sageland Collaborative. So the Triad Project partners held a restoration workshop in August, inviting local landowners and agencies and nonprofits, scholars, practitioners, all to come together. So we started on a landowner's ranch in a nearby stream, who shared what he's done with his stream restoration work, his love of beavers, and reflected his own identity as tied to the land as a long-term rancher, and the ways that he has tied this work into his legacy and livelihood. And then we moved down to the Wuda-Ogwa site itself, where the tribe shared more of their work, and focused on, again, this piece that I discovered of transparency, describing their own, values and desires to work with the community and their plans for the site. And we're really excited that one landowner on Battle Creek asked one of the colleagues there about doing similar work on his own land. So just to drive it home, it only takes one, and to find the one, we've got to engage values. So that is critical for all of our projects. But yeah, that's what I have. Big thanks to all who have made this possible, who have funded, especially Sageland Collaborative and the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Excuse me. So the first, I don't know if you can see them, but I'll read them out for everybody. I don't know who sees what in our new format, to be honest. So the first question is, what were the main products of the landowners you interviewed?
Oh, great question. Alfalfa was a really big one, which is of particular concern because of how water intensive it is in this region. There were also, oh gosh, let me try to remember, rapeseed and, oh, what was the other main? Corn, and there's one other, but alfalfa was a big one. And then there were also a number of ranchers that mainly ranched that I interviewed.
Next question was, based on your experience and research, what do you think is a common misconception that restoration practitioners have about rural landowners in the West?
Wow, that is a really good question. Um, I think there are a few things. Two really come to mind. The first is that um, gosh, that there is not a conservation ethic or a care for the land. Um, that came up in a few interviews and conversations with landowners, that like there are these conservation groups who kind of come in and want to tell us what to do and how to take care of the land. And we've been taking care of it for a long time. Specifically at this site, gosh, maybe 40 years ago or something, the university had come in and planted Russian olives, which landowners now are like trying to get out. And yeah, so they kind of reflected on like they think that they know what to do, but we know the land and we've been here and they mess up kind of thing. So yeah, one thing is this kind of idea that there's not a land ethic or care. It looks different because livelihood is of course a part of that, and use of the land is very different from other types of like recreation relationships with land or distant relationships with land. So that was one. And then kind of this other related piece that I mentioned is this idea that landowners are perhaps valuing lands and waters based on their ability to use them, which of course is true to some extent, but it's also more complicated than that. There's a lot kind of deeper relational things happening that I don't think practitioners are always fully aware of until, of course, they engage with these folks and learn from them. Yeah, so that's what comes to mind. Thanks for the question. I hope that answers it.
Yes, I have a question. So, I think you linked a lot of it to livelihood and identity, which, I can see that you have this gut feeling about these things. Did you come across kind of some maybe positive examples where, people said, look, I've maybe one area that's drier, certainly we're going through more droughts out there, and have an area where there are beaver and it's wetter, and maybe you have more fertile soil and you have health, there's healthy river skates actually provide a benefit that, I don't know if it has to be on, one person's land where they have the juxtaposition, but something that maybe somebody who was a landowner found unexpected or made them actually not just resistant to restoration or conservation.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I did identify a number of opportunities. I kind of focus on the barriers here, just because that's something that maybe is more useful to the tribe to immediately work with in this project and other partners. But yeah, there definitely were notes on like healthier water systems. I think this context is somewhat unique in that landowners are thinking often of the stream as like a ditch. Like there were a couple of folks who were not aware that it was a stream or a creek, but thought of it as irrigation. So in that case, I didn't see some of these things that you're asking about, but there were some cases for sure where folks noted, where there is healthier riparian areas and how that benefits their operation. And specifically in that restoration workshop, we had one landowner who has done a lot of stream restoration work, who was able to share that with other landowners and physically show like these increased groceries for grazing, and yeah, showcase all the good stuff that he's seen from bringing beavers in, and to understand, some of the difficulties with culverts and all of that. So yeah, so that did come up. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I just didn't, it's great to see you kind of right when at the end when my question was, oh, is there anyone who has an example to change people's minds? And it looks like you have one, so maybe it's starting. I just didn't know if there are just other examples on the landscape. So cool.
Yeah.
Hey, Avery, can we unmute Jackie so she can ask a question? I have no idea how to do that.
No, we can't because they're just observing as participants right now. Sorry.
Okay. Hey, Jackie, if you can write it in the Q&A, we can try and read it. I guess we'll figure that out. So just my one other question, then I'll stop talking is, you talked about the landowners. Did the landowners have feelings, or did you even look into what maybe the attitudes and perceptions might be by regulators, people who are in charge of doing the permits, or even policymakers in that area?
No, that would be fascinating. I did have some meetings and kind of contextualizing stuff, like going to that adjudication meeting and having, yeah, some meetings with managers. And some of the folks that I interviewed were involved in some form of water management, like being a water master. But no, I didn't look specifically into some of those other values and perceptions, which would be really interesting. I would love to see that kind of research.
And one of the questions from Jeff Bolen-Prom that builds on what Brian just asked is, did you find any difference in attitudes towards beavers between ranchers and irrigating row crop farmers?
That's a great question. I actually had not considered the difference. A lot of, again, this is a small community, and a lot of them do both farming and ranching on their properties and in their operations. So I didn't kind of include that in my analysis, but I'm trying to think back. I'll think more about that. I would love to follow up with you. Send me an email and I'll look at the data and think about that. Because yeah, I didn't think too much about that piece.
So we still have time for some questions. And hopefully Jackie can type her question into, oh, there we go. Here is one. From Janice Gardner. Sarah, if there wasn't one rancher with a good example of working with beaver, what other approaches do you think could be productive for building collaboration with shared values?
Yes, that's a wonderful question, because yeah, the literature does really support working with rural landowners and specifically producers. Peer-to-peer information sharing is the most effective, so that's ideal. However, that's of course not always the situation that we have. Often we're trying to find who that one person is that might start to share ideas in a community. So yeah, I think that identifying what share, I mean, this is quite basic, but identifying shared ground between conservationists and landowners, understanding and really valuing some of the ways that folks are already engaging with the land and speaking to those shared spaces is critical. I also think one thing that I found in this research was it was quite meaningful and like really engaged a lot of folks to ask them about their knowledge, which is of course just true in any form of communication. People want to share what they know and their information. So I guess approaching humbly some of these spaces, asking for information and discovering shared goals and values is kind of what I would say. And then, yeah, I think, again, focusing on some of those values that might not first come to mind, understanding the depth of like identity and self-definition that are tied to a place and how land is being treated. So it does really matter how you're going into, of course, a conservation project and collaboration in a rural landowner space. Yeah, that's what I'd share.
So we have a few more, and then just to clarify, it turns out Rose was sharing a account with Janice, so that question was from Rose. Jackie Corday's question is in the chat, and it has to do with Dr. Susan Charnley's social science research, and if you found any parallels to her conclusions that supporting landowners not only with restoration work, but also post-project coexistence was key.
Yeah, I am not familiar with Dr. Charnley's work. I'll have to look into that. But I will say that, yes, like I think with a lot of these projects, working with various types of communities, the long-term focus is a really big deal. I think with this project specifically, there had been some concerns early on among landowners about what the tribe was doing and some fears about how that might change the land around there and how that might influence folks' operations and just their lives. Like if there would be a bunch of people coming in, that was kind of a concern. So yeah, I mean, this work that's happening now, some of these restoration workshops is more in this kind of, the project has been started and now it's continuing to foster these relationships. So that has been really important to kind of avoid what could happen, which is folks starting to talk and kind of operate out of fear of change or what's happening that they're not aware of. So, but yeah, I'll have to look into Dr. Tranley's work. Thanks for sharing.
And there was another comment, either from Janice or Rose, that based around Sageland's work, that they see a difference between irrigators and ranchers who work in the upper portion of their watershed in terms, I assume, of their perceptions. And so I guess my question was, you're working on this very specific area. So how, for those of us that are looking to work across rural environments, like how well can we actually extrapolate to larger regional perceptions?
Yeah, that's certainly a huge limitation of this study, is it's a very small, specific context. So that should be, you know, central to kind of thinking about applying some of this work and findings to other regions. I would love to see, you know, so like I mentioned in the further research opportunities, this thinking applied to various communities to see how it applies across contexts. I do think that something that's really unique and that I would imagine applying pretty quickly is this particular interaction between a rural community who's descended from settlers as well as an Indigenous community. Like this is a really unique kind of meeting of communities, and it's a specific restoration project. So that's specific enough that I would certainly extrapolate for other kind of similar projects. And yeah, so I would say some of the values identified do speak to wider literatures and kind of what seems to be the case regionally and beyond. I'm thinking specifically of some of these kind of LDS values. That's like a second piece of my research that I didn't go into. But yeah, it's a very small group, very small area.
And I agree. The comment back was, don't sell yourself short. The maps you show cover a huge region, and learning about these values has implications across the Intermountain West. And a strength of your study is this mix of the producers in the area include a mix of grazers, croplands, and irrigation/canal companies. And so you have a very diverse group that you're working with, which is the strength. A practical question. Was irrigation from surface and groundwater or deep aquifers?
Oh gosh, I wonder if Rose knows this. I'm actually not sure. I am not a stream scientist.
Well, this is why we wanted to have you here, is to bring these potential collaborations and ideas together. Yeah. I don't know, Rose, if you can answer that or not. We'll see if it pops in.
Not to put anyone on the spot, but I'm not sure. I know, gosh, I think that there's a mix, but I don't even want to speak to it because I'm not aware.
She thinks streams, at least most of it. So, does anybody have? Go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to ask, talking a lot about restoration, was there, this often happens, was there a desire from landowners that, or maybe even just a feeling that conservation of healthier areas often upstream would be beneficial, where, I've run into lots of folks and, happens to all of us where, oh, we'd love to have conservation up there, but that doesn't impact me, but I would get the benefits. Was there a sense of that, or?
I would say to that, the main kind of feeling related to that was, I'm fine if you do restoration in another part of the stream, but I don't want my operation to be affected in any way. Like, I don't want the way that I use the water or my actual amount of land dedicated to crops. I don't want it to be changed by stream restoration. So there was some of that. There was kind of this sense that if restoration can happen in a way that does not influence me, doesn't ask time or resources from me, and doesn't change my operation, that's fine. We'd have to talk if there's any kind of, potential shift that would happen to me or influence that would happen to me. So yeah, this kind of desire for transparency was a big one. And there wasn't, on the benefits piece of that question, I didn't find too much immediate feeling that there would be benefits to stream restoration. Again, because a lot of kind of the thinking around the stream is that it's a ditch and that it's just, you know, carrying water essentially. So yeah, there wasn't too much of like an immediate feeling that there are benefits.
So Avery informs me we have less than 1 minute on the webinar. And so if it cuts out, that's why. I wanted to thank Sarah for being our speaker today. And as she said, she's willing to answer questions by email. So I encourage you to contact her. Jackie put a couple of links into the chat about the research from Susan Charnley. And any announcements, Brian, before we go? Those of you who are going to BeaverCon, we're excited to see you at the open house.
Yep, that's it. Yeah, hope to see you all at BeaverCon. It'd be great to actually meet people, not in a Zoom screen.
So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Sarah.
Thank you
And
so much.
Sarah's contact is in the chat.
Yes.
Yep. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was great.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Bye.
Bye-bye.